we go. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Down.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, welcome to class. It's a nice morning. Of course, it's always a good morning when you're here. Still here on the planet. It's a good day, right? I just want to emphasize a couple of things here. And well, I've talked about this before, but on here, can you see my screen? It says the Cengage MindTap stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to emphasize again that you really can't get this stuff just relying on me. I mean, I have many shortcomings, and but even then, even the very greatest in the history of the world economics instructor isn't going to be enough. Just class. You really got to be sure to read the text and take advantage of these things like video problem walkthroughs. Those are very helpful in learning and understanding, as is the chapter quiz. That's a practice, but those things. Now the homework, this homework, that's kind of the last. That should be the last thing you do. But there's a lot of stuff in here, and of course, hopefully the class helps. But it's more like a piece of it's more like a puzzle with a few pieces here. There's the class, what we're doing now, and then there's the textbook, and then there's these video problem walkthroughs, and so on, and practice quizzes and so forth to really get prepared. So don't neglect that stuff, especially in this chapter. I mean, this chapter is a little tougher, but anyway, I just want to emphasize that you're on camera. Oh, sorry. My wife was coming in here in her robe, taking away my dessert from last night, and telling her she was on camera did the trick. Phew. That was close. Some peach cobbler here. I got sitting on my desk. So, where was I? Okay, let's start with. Let's finish up the video we were starting yesterday. About monetary policy. Monetary policy is, well, I'm going to say an attempt to manage aggregate demand, the Federal Reserve, through money supply and interest rates. So let's finish that up. But again, I just wanted to emphasize, don't forget about this stuff, the text and the other resources here, very helpful and very important. Okay, well, let's finish that up, and then we'll move on to the short run aggregate supply curve. This is roughly where we left off.
On his first day in office, Chairman Greenspan revealed his wish list.
A dollar which is always stable, interest rates which stay low, and employment which stays high.
His first action as chairman of the Board of Governors was to reaffirm Volcker's tight money policy, a long-range strategy that most economists believed was crucial to maintaining orderly economic growth. But if there was one sector of the economy that was far from orderly in 1987, it was the stock market.
Angel 784.
Greenspan feared a collapse. But what could the Fed do? Securities analyst Roger Kubarich.
when Chairman Greenspan came in office in August, one of the first things he did was to launch a series of studies, call them war games if you like, that did include both the board staff in Washington, members of the board, and the New York Fed on a number of possible scenarios for market disruption, financial market disruption.
On October 19th, 1987, Greenspan got an unwelcome opportunity to test his plans. The market fell 508 points, more than 5 times greater than the 1929 drop which precipitated the Great Depression. Many investors faced total financial ruin.
There was a clear picture of an impending problem of monumental proportions. So it was a fascination. It was like watching a car accident that was happening right on your block.
The business of buying and selling stocks is based on confidence. By Tuesday morning, October 20th, confidence had fled. What were people afraid of? We asked economic forecaster Nariman Behravesh.
The specter of a 1929-style depression loomed very large for the markets and for the Federal Reserve. The kind of scenario the Fed was most worried about was that people had borrowed a lot to finance purchasing stock as the stock market rose. As it crashed, a lot of those loans were called in, and the Fed was worried that there'd be a lot of bankruptcies, personal bankruptcies, corporate bankruptcies. As those occurred, a lot of people would be laid off, the unemployment rate would rise, and you'd have a full-scale recession and maybe even a depression on your hands.
A bank run seemed imminent. Banks needed liquidity immediately. How would the nation's central banker respond?
What the Fed did was twofold. It supplied liquidity through ordinary open market operations and through use of the discount window. Very standard techniques of supplying liquidity. But under the guidance of Chairman Greenspan, they also sought to reduce the demand for liquidity. In other words, to use what you might call tender persuasion to convince people that they needn't go seeking liquidity, bidding for liquidity, that it would be there.
In 1929, the Fed tightened the money supply. This time, Greenspan did the opposite. The Fed's message was, whatever you need, we'll give you. Greenspan had said the magic words, but was anyone listening? On Tuesday morning, the market continued its dive, plunging 225 points. By noon, the market was approaching complete meltdown. Buying was at a virtual standstill. Then, buy orders began trickling in like water upon parched land. The buying trend accelerated, and Wednesday morning the world awoke to headlines touting the largest rally in the big board's history.
6 for 200, 2 and 8, sold. 2 trades at 6. Houston sells 2 at 6 to done.
Monetary policy works in mysterious ways, little understood outside the economic community. But on Tuesday, October 20th, 1987, Alan Greenspan demonstrated both the power and the flexibility of the Federal Reserve. His willingness to turn his back on long-term tight money policies and pump cash into a desperate economy helped save the stock market and, quite possibly, the economy. We asked economic analyst Richard Gill what this emergency intervention has to do with the demands we place on monetary policy.
Well, perhaps the basic thing it shows is that although it might be nice to focus on keeping things steady in the long run, there are times when human judgment and discretion are crucial. The fall in the stock market in October 1987 was real. The dangers of a profound effect on the economy, equally real. Numerous commentators observed that the parallels to 1929 were ominous. Even the upturn in the market in late 1987 had had its parallel in the 1920s, only to be followed by a further collapse and the greatest depression of all times. But it didn't happen. And one reason was that theories of long-run steadiness gave way immediately to an appreciation of the crisis. Did we need more money, more liquidity? We would have it, the Fed told us quickly and unequivocally. Forget general rules, handle the crisis first. Which leaves us where? Perhaps better off in economic fact than in economic theory. Cruise control is great in automobiles on the open highway, but when the traffic gets hot and heavy, there is, alas, no substitute for human judgment. Hopefully, good judgment.
Clearly, sustained low inflation implies less uncertainty about the future, and lower risk premiums imply higher prices of stocks and other earning assets. But how do we know when irrational exuberance has unduly escalated asset values?
How do we know?
Well, if you're an average consumer, you probably don't. But if you're on the Federal Reserve Board, it's your job to know, or at least make an informed decision on how to use the tools of monetary policy to control the economy. And since these tools were used so effectively in the last few decades of the 20th century, you would assume they would work well in the new century. Well, think again.
After the 1987 market crash, the Federal Reserve temporarily pumped cash into the economy, quelling the fears of investors. E-business began to bloom. Stock prices shot up. Irrational or not, the internet captured entrepreneurial imagination. Anything that was .com seemed likely to succeed.
So in the latter part of the 1990s, there was a big surge in productivity. So as the stock prices rose, we raised interest rates in order to keep inflation under control. And then when stock prices fell, we lowered interest rates in order to prevent unemployment from rising even more substantially than it did.
Starting in 1999, the Federal Reserve increased interest rates 6 times, and predictably, the economy began to lose speed. When the tech bubble finally burst, stocks plummeted, and nearly half of the .com business went belly up.
Monetary policy works with lags on the economy. What the Federal Reserve does today has effects on the U.S. economy and to some extent on the global economy over the next several years. So it's always got to be a forward-looking kind of process. That's one of the vulnerabilities. One can never predict accurately what's going to happen.
Despite the destruction of roughly $5 trillion in paper wealth, not one financial institution of any size failed. Once again, the Fed lowered interest rates, easing the money supply.
The same issues came up in the context of the housing market, 2004, 5, 6, 7. So should the Federal Reserve have tightened monetary policy by more than we did?
In 2006, when Benjamin Bernanke took over as chairman of the Fed, the housing market had already been heating up.
We were tightening in 2005 and 2006, but should we have tightened more in order to take the steam out of the housing market and to prevent the subsequent disaster?
There's a lot of controversy about the role of the Federal Reserve, because there are 2 things it does. First, it broadly controls the monetary policy of the United States. That is, effectively it determines whether it's easy to borrow money and cheap or hard and expensive. And there are people who think it kept money too easy and too cheap for too long, and this helped feed the bubble. I've been asked by, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, to give a grade to Ben Bernanke. So I forget exactly what it was, but my point simply was it was a lousy grade before the crisis, because I do think the Fed could have done more to deal with the beginnings of the crisis, the things that created it.
My personal view is that we kept our eyes on the right thing, which is the macroeconomy. That's our legislative mandate. In the Federal Reserve Act, maximum employment and stable prices. That's what we were trying to promote.
When the housing bubble burst, the banking system was in turmoil. Unemployment rose to levels not seen for decades. The president, congressional leaders, politicians put everything aside in an attempt to deal with the crisis. What could the Fed do?
In December of 2008, the economy was hit with such a severe shock arising from the failure of Lehman Brothers and the financial panic that followed that the Federal Reserve reduced its interest rates essentially to zero.
And still, the economy didn't budge.
How does the Federal Reserve go about stimulating spending under these circumstances when that federal funds rate is already at zero? The way the Federal Reserve chose to do that was to purchase intermediate and longer term securities and hopefully drive down the interest rates, having the same effects I talked about on the incentive to spend on houses and cars and capital equipment. But it was an unusual, unprecedented situation in which the usual instrument that the Federal Reserve uses to equilibrate and calibrate the economy to keep it on an even keel was no longer available because it was already at zero.
We thought this was an important step, and that it was at an important time when we were all worried about a double dip and we were worried about deflation.
Despite the injection of cash into the economy, growth remained low and unemployment high.
In terms of growth and unemployment, over the long run capacity of the economy to grow and the unemployment rate consistent with sustained stable growth are really determined outside the central bank.
But in 2011, monetary policy appeared to be stuck. Inflation seemed to be under control, but unemployment continued to hover at 9%. We asked economic analyst Nariman Behravesh if monetary policy was still alive.
Despite the sluggish recovery after the Great Recession, most economists give the Fed fairly high marks for its crisis management. It prevented the worst financial crisis since the 1930s from turning into another Great Depression. There is a much less charitable view of the Fed's role in the period before the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Many economists believe that in 2003 and 2004, the Fed kept interest rates too low for too long, and in the process contributed to the housing bubble that was a root cause of the financial meltdown. Some have even called the Fed a serial bubble blower, referring to the tech bubble of the 1990s and the housing bubble of the 2000s. More thoughtful analysts worry that the response of central banks to asset bubbles has been dangerously asymmetrical. Benign neglect when prices are rising and dramatic action when they are falling. While some of this criticism is justified, hindsight is 20/20, and operationally targeting asset prices can be difficult. Here are a few points to ponder. First, the Fed and other central banks don't have a mandate to burst asset bubbles. Second, it is often very difficult to be sure that a rise in asset prices is symptomatic of a speculative bubble. Third, if a central bank overreacts to a bubble, the cure may be worse than the disease. Nevertheless, given the boom-bust cycle of asset prices since the 1990s, central bankers will have to pay much more attention to them in the future than they have in the past.
Monetary policy was an effective factor in holding down inflation in the booming 90s. But the very low interest rates in the first decade of the 21st century became a major cause of the credit binge, the housing bubble, and the banking crisis. Once the crisis occurred, the Fed earned high marks for limiting the damage. But how well monetary policy will work in the future is hard to say. We'll just have to wait and see. For this 21st century edition of Economics USA.
Okay, we'll talk more about monetary policy in the next chapter, but this is just kind of getting you a little bit lubricated here, ready to go. Let's go over to and look at the short run. Last time we talked about the aggregate demand curve, why it slopes down and what shifts it. Now we're going to look at that aggregate supply curve. Here we go. I'm not a robot. That's not happened before. Okay, first of all, you still there? You can see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Short run aggregate supply. Okay. All right. Very good. Okay.
Now we're going to talk about the short run aggregate.
Admittedly, this is a bit dry and difficult. Well, I don't know how difficult it is, but it's a little dry. And that, of course, that always makes things a little difficult. I'm recording this lecture and we'll post it. You may want to take a look at this again, but actually your time would probably be better spent to watch this once and hit the textbook and some of the resources there. That way you get different things, get this from different angles. Anyway, here we go.
Now we're going to talk about the short run aggregate supply. Well, with a single good, the supply curve slopes up. When the price of the good rises, a firm will increase its output. Because this is a relative price increase. They can now get a higher price relative to other prices, relative to their costs, right? So they're willing now to produce more than they did before. Well, the same is true of the short run aggregate supply curve. It also slopes up, which is very fortunate. Short run aggregate supply. Here's GDP on this axis and the price level on this axis. And there you go. Looks just like the supply curve we've all been enjoying throughout the semester. Well, but like the aggregate demand curve, it slopes up for different reasons. Not because of relative price changes, because there are no relative price changes. We're talking about a price level, an index of all prices. So why does it slope up? The short run aggregate supply can deviate from the natural level of output. That is, from the natural level of output, remember, is where the long run aggregate supply curve is. And this is the natural level of output. Short run aggregate supply can deviate from that when the price level deviates from the expected price level. So when things turn out differently than what people thought they were going to be, that's another way to say that. Or when inflation is different than what was expected. So why does this thing slope up? Well, the first reason is the misperceptions theory. Production decisions are based on the firm's expectation of what the price level is going to be. And if the price level unexpectedly, let's say in our example, rises above what they thought it was going to be. Another way to say this is inflation turned out to be higher than what they thought it was going to be. And therefore, for a short time, okay, there's a period of time where the information is not going to be complete. For a short period of time, while this information is incomplete, firms are going to misperceive the situation. They're not going to understand, or they're not going to know that inflation turned out to be higher than what they thought, at first they're going to think this is a relative price change in their favor. And for a short period of time, while that information is being complete, or while it's incomplete, until it's complete, they will increase their output. Okay, for example, let's say that the expected inflation rate is 5%. Let's say it's been 5% for the last 500 years, all right? Every year. It's always 5%, right? So if we're starting out with a price level of 100, a 5% inflation rate means the expected price level is going to be 105 in this next year, after a year, okay? But it turns out that inflation is actually 10%. But we don't know that for a while. So the expected price level, so the price level turns out to be 110. It was expected to be 105. It turns out to be 110. But, again, for a period, however long that may be, there's going to be a time when firms are going to misperceive. They're going to think this inflation rate, this higher than expected price level, is simply a relative change in their favor, and they will increase their output. So even though there's the price level going up, even though it's not a relative price change, they will misperceive the situation and increase their output. Thus, in the short run, an upward sloping supply curve makes sense. However, once it is known, once information is complete and they realize that, oops, this was just an overall inflation rate. This is not a relative price change in our favor. This was just an overall inflation. They will adjust back again to the natural rate of output. They'll make an adjustment and go back to where they were before. Another reason why the short-run aggregate supply curve would slope up is because of the sticky wage theory. Wages tend to be slow to adjust. They're sticky, in other words. And this is partly due to long-term contracts. And these contracts are based both on the firms and the workers' expectations of what the price levels are going to be in the future. Or, put another way, it's based on their expectations of what they think inflation is going to be. And so they come to an agreement about what kind of wage increases or cost of living increases they're going to receive. And they sign the contract. Well, going back to our previous example where inflation turns out to be higher than expected, this gives the firm an opportunity to crank out some extra goods, okay, and make it an extra profit. For example, let's say the price of the product that the firm sells goes up by 10% because that ends up being what the inflation rate is. However, their labor costs, because they entered into a contract because everybody thought inflation would be 5%, they entered into a contract that would increase wages 5%. But it turns out that inflation was 10. However, their contract says 5. So they raise wages by 5. They increase their price of the product that they're selling goes up by 10. And that means profits go up. So they have again, in the short run, they have an opportunity to make a few extra bucks. And therefore, when that price level goes up, they are going to crank out more output in the short run. Now, guess what? When that contract comes up to be renegotiated, that's going to come to an end. And then they'll adjust back to where they were. That extra profit won't be available. And last, the sticky price theory. Well, again, prices and output are set according to expectations about what the price level is expected to be. If the price level rises above that which was expected, the firm will need to raise its prices. However, it is not costless to raise prices. You know, they got to change the price, they got to print new materials, new menus, new catalogs, price tags. These are menu costs, and we talked a little bit about those when we talked about inflation. And you know, you're going to, the price isn't always going to be exactly where it ought to be. In fact, if inflation is higher than expected, those prices, at least for a time, are going to be lower than they ought to be. And with lower prices relative to what they ought to be, there's going to be excess demand for your product, right? And so there'll be more produced as more is demanded. And so again, because of the unexpectedly high price level, for a time, the prices of the good will be lower than it would normally be, and we would have more demand and therefore more output due to sticky prices. And of course, in the long run, when all information is complete and they understand, hey, you know, this is just inflation was higher than we thought. We had an underpriced product. They adjust their production accordingly. Okay, so those are the reasons why the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes up. We've got sticky prices, sticky wages, and misperceptions. Now we're going to look at why it shifts. What shifts? Well, first of all, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift whenever the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts. Here's the long-run aggregate supply curve. Well, let me fill this in. And the short run looks like that. There you go. In equilibrium, we're right there. Here's our natural rate of output, natural level of output. Okay. So, what shifts the long-run average aggregate supply curve? Remember, labor, an increase in labor, an increase in capital. That's both human capital and physical capital. Natural resources either become newly discovered or newly available. And technology. So any of those is going to increase the long-run aggregate supply curve. That'll shift out to the right. Well, whenever the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts right along with it. Think of it as being kind of pinned. It's pinned on there. It's glued, okay? It goes right along with it. So anytime the long run curve shifts, short run shifts with it. Because the short run aggregate supply curve's job is to explain deviations from the long run. We started out there. The job of this short run aggregate supply curve is to explain deviations away from the long run. Well, when the long run curve shifts, that short run curve has to shift right along with it because it's got a job to do. It's going to explain those deviations from the long run curve. So, again, when the long run curve shifts, the short run curve shifts with it. So, change in labor, capital, natural resources, technology will shift the long run and the short run curve. But it'll also shift by itself when there's a change in the expected price level. Now, that sounds very similar, but it's very different to what we talked about before. We talked about why the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes up. And basically, it slopes up when the real, actual inflation rate turns out to be different than what we expected. So things didn't turn out the way we expected them to turn out. However, here we're saying that what we expect the future to be changes. We've changed our minds about what's going to happen down the road. So there's a difference. There's a difference when something we expected turns out to be different. And here we're expecting something different. Okay, so I know that's about as confusing as it gets. But here we are changing what we expect the price level to be. And that will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. So here we are with the long-run aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply curve. Now, inflation was expected to be 5%. We'll go back to our previous example. Price of goods sold was expected to be 5%, and because the inflation rate was expected to be 5%, and therefore they entered into contracts for wages to go up by 5%, and everything's good. Everything's expected as we expected. However, inflation turns out to be higher than expected. So it actually goes up 10%. And for a while, profits go up, and the firm is willing to increase its output. That, remember, is one of the reasons we have an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. However, the story doesn't end there, because people getting these wage increases of 5%, when inflation turns out to be 10%, so their cost of living is going up 10%, they're only getting wages of 5%, they're going to say, hey, company I work for, Mr. Boss, we need to renegotiate our salaries because it appears that all these years we've had inflation of 5, and therefore we've always expected 5, but now things have changed. We expect this 10% inflation to be the reality from now on. And so see, there's a change in inflation expectations. And they're going to renegotiate, and they're going to, maybe they'll threaten a strike. And then this will change. And then we can forget about that. So what happens there when the costs go up, when things change, when the inflationary expectations change and the response to it, that will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Or, I think more intuitively, up. Higher costs, it shifts up. But just be aware that it's equally accurate to describe that as a leftward shift. So you may see that too in the terminology. But I think to get the shift right, costs have gone up, inflationary expectations have gone up. That means costs have gone up, or expected to go up, okay? There we are. It's an upward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Now let's go the other direction. You know, so far we've always been dealing with inflation. What if inflation turns out to be higher than expected, and then later our expectations of future inflation go up? Well, how about let's go with our inflation expectations fall. And using the labor market to illustrate this. Okay, let's say the price of goods that are being sold are expected to go up 10%. See, everybody's revised their inflationary expectations upward. We expect inflation to be 10% now. And labor costs or wages, we have a contract now that says we're going to raise your cost of living. Cost of living increases. Your wages are going to go up by 10% each year. So that's in the contract. However, things change. Inflation actually ends up being 5%. And to the point where we gradually change our inflation expectations, our expectations of future inflation, from 10 down to 5. So what the firm has going on here is the price of the goods being sold are now only rising by 5%. In the meantime, their labor costs, which is their greatest cost of any firm encounters, is their labor costs, goes up by 10%. So their profits are falling. They've got their costs going up by 10 because they've got a contract that says we're going to give these cost of living increases, but they're only able to raise their prices by 5%. The new reality is that inflation is 5%. So what they're going to do, they're going to come back to their workers and say, hey, we all expected inflation to be 10%. But now it's very clear that it's going to be 5%. So again, see, there's a change in inflation expectations. We got to renegotiate this. Otherwise, we're going to have to lay people off, okay, because we can't afford it. So what happens is labor costs will fall back to 5% increases, and that would be a downward shift in our short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, down or out to the right. Again, keep in mind that's the same shift. I just think it's more intuitive to say it's a downward shift. Costs go down, it shifts down. But also, you might encounter language in there that calls it a rightward shift. Just be aware that that's the same shift. Okay, to sum things up, the short run aggregate supply curve slopes up because of unexpected changes in the price level. This is when things turn out differently than what you thought they were going to. And in the short run, all are sorting this out before they realize that things are different than they were expected to be. They think it's a relative price change for a short term. These unexpected changes can cause firms to supply more or less than the natural level of output. Okay, they will deviate. That's why they have got the short-run aggregate supply curve sloping up. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift when there is a change in expected price level. So it slopes up when there are unexpected changes in the price level. It'll shift when there's a change in the expected price level. Okay, I know. Run that by your brain a few times. It slopes up because things turn out differently than we expected. It shifts when what we expect changes. All right.
Okay, well, let's go on in and let's put them all together now. Aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. Now we've got the full model. Let's go in and play around with this.
Now we're going to talk about economic fluctuations. We're going to put all this together. We've got our aggregate supply and demand. Here's long run aggregate supply. Here's aggregate demand. And short run aggregate supply. So here we are, we're at the long run equilibrium. That means that perceptions, expectations, wages, prices, everything have fully adjusted so that the intersection of aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, we're right there, right smack on the long run aggregate supply curve, meaning we are producing at the natural level of output. Implied there is that if we're at the natural level of output, we're also at the natural rate of unemployment. And here's the current price level. Okay, well, here we've got happy days. We've got stock market's up, and the war is ending. Okay, confidence is high, and everything's looking great. So, what's happening here? Well, stocks. Well, here's our components of GDP or aggregate demand. Well, a high stock market's going to increase consumption, but it's also going to increase investment too. High stock market will make it cheaper for firms to raise financing. They get a bigger bang for their per share of stock that they issue. And that can stimulate financing and capital investment as well. So that is going to shift the aggregate demand curve out to the right. And here we are, a new equilibrium. We have an increasing price level. We have increased output. But notice that we've got this expansion going, but we have inflation going too. So on this graph, let's go up here a little bit. Going back to our business cycle graph, where we plot GDP over time, we've got these fluctuations. Right now, we're up here somewhere, okay? We're at a point in time where this is the long-run equilibrium, but we're actually up here. Okay, now you can see this is the long-run equilibrium, but we're up here above it. Okay, and that's what's happening here. We're above. Here's the long run. We're actually above it temporarily. Can't be there. Can't be above the long run sustainable output, for very long. But we are. We're cruising along. We've got some inflation, and that's what it looks like on this graph. We're up here. And note that with output above our natural level of output, unemployment would be below its natural rate of unemployment. So let's say unemployment is 5%. Typically, it's going to be below that during this boom here, maybe 4%. Okay, something below the natural rate. Well, what's going to happen? Ultimately, expectations will catch up to the new reality of a higher output and higher prices. So now we're going to begin to see a change in the expected price level. Okay, so expectations are gradually going to change. And that is going to, how do we reflect? How do we model changes in expectations? Well, here we go. This is going to be shifting up gradually as expectations change, and we're going to move right along here until boom. There's our new short-run aggregate supply curve, and we stop right there. And we've got a little bit higher prices there, but output is back to long-run equilibrium. So we have aggregate demand shifting out in response to this high stock market and confidence, and everything's wonderful, and everyone's excited, and wow, economy's booming, but we got inflation. But over time, those expectations will start to settle in. They'll start to change. This inflation, this new higher inflation, is going to change people's expectations, firms' expectations, and they're going to start to express those changes, and we model those changes in expectations by this shifting curve is going up, going to shift up or back to the left. And that's what brings us back into equilibrium. And that's what will happen. And on this graph, that would be, we're kind of back here. So we've gone, whoa, and now we're back right there. A major driver in this change is because of this inflation, workers will demand higher wages to keep up with this new expansion and new inflation. So think back to the examples we gave before. As workers want higher wages and say, look, we got to have higher wages. This inflation wasn't expected. It's higher than expected. So we, look, our expectations have changed. We thought it was going to be 5%. It's actually 10%, and looks like it's going to keep being 10%. So the higher wages increase firms' costs, and it drives us back here to the long-run equilibrium. Okay, so what did we just learn? An aggregate demand shift in the short run will cause a fluctuation in output. It'll cause that change in output. But in the long run, aggregate demand shifts will cause a change in the price level, but no change in output. So in the short run, a change in output, yes, from a change in aggregate demand, but not in the long run. All you'll be left with is a change in the price level, as we saw here. We saw aggregate demand shift out to the right, and we saw the higher price level. Then with the change in expectations, as a result of all that, we saw the shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve upward, reflecting higher costs, higher wages, and we're back from here, we're back to here. But this stays with us. Basically, we just went along there. Now let's look at how this model does in explaining real-world events. We'll start with the Great Depression. Here are the facts of the Great Depression. From 1929 to 1933, real GDP fell 27%. That's enormous. Unemployment went from 3% to 25%. And prices, the overall price level fell 22%. So how would we model this with our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model? We can, here's our long-run aggregate supply. Here's our short-run aggregate supply. Here's our aggregate demand. Okay, well, we start out here in equilibrium. There's our equilibrium price. Here's our equilibrium quantity. All right, so what happened? The Great Depression was the result of an enormous decline in aggregate demand. Prices fell, like I said, 27%. GDP fell 27%, and unemployment went from 3% to 25%. So this is minus 27% here. Wait, sorry, wrong number. This was 22%. So prices were down 22%. This here in output, this is minus 27% in output. And unemployment, well, went from 3% to 25%. Okay, so unemployment was 3% here and 25% here. Okay. So why was there such a huge decrease in aggregate demand? Well, first of all, stock prices collapsed. There was a huge stock market crash, okay, and that meant consumption falls. Consumption is about roughly 2/3 of GDP, okay, or aggregate demand. So that's a huge hit right there. But even then, this was your ordinary recession until the bank failures. With the bank failures, think back to multiple deposit creation. How deposits in the bank, depending on the multiplier, each dollar deposits will support a multiple of that in money supply. Now think of that in reverse. Everybody's panicking. Now remember, back then, we didn't have the FDIC. We didn't have insured deposits. Banks were just like other businesses, and they failed. And if your money was in a bank that went out of business, that was tough luck. So with people being nervous, withdrawing their money, and banks don't have the money there in the safe. They've lent it out. So everybody wants their money at once. The bank doesn't have it, and the bank closes its doors. And as banks failed over and over and over, the money supply fell by 28%. So, so that's why you had this enormous shift. So prior to the bank, let's say this is the shift with the stock market crash. Okay, well, that's not a very good line. Here we are. We got a little recession going. Not fun. But here it is. Add all the bank failures, and it just shifted this aggregate demand curve way left. So that is basically the Great Depression. And our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model does a great job of explaining it. It was simply a major collapse in aggregate demand. Stock prices got us into a recession as consumption fell. Bank failures put us into the Great Depression, and that's where the Federal Reserve dropped the ball. They just, in all fairness, like I say, hindsight's 20/20. But you look at how the Federal Reserve handled the Great Depression. These bank failures, it's astonishing. With today's knowledge, it's astonishing. But that's what put us in the Great Depression. So how might we have gotten out of the Great Depression? Well, here we are again with aggregate demand way back here. Prices have collapsed, output collapsed, unemployment sky high. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is over time, as expectations change, so we've got falling prices. That means and this is a good way to think of the short-run aggregate supply curve. we've got firms saying to their employees, hey, employees, sorry, guys, we have got to cut your wages because the price of our product has gone way down here, and yet you're still earning wages, way up here. So over time, as those expectations change and as workers as well begin to accept that the things have changed, over time, we've got the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting down. And over time, gradually, we've got, we're back at full employment. Right here, we're back at full employment, natural rate of output. But we've got a lower price level. That's what would have happened if things were just left to themselves. So, however, there were a couple of things that kept prices from falling, or wages, for one. One was the minimum wage was instituted. They for some reason, I mean, again, this is hindsight's always 20/20. But the President Roosevelt did a couple of things. One thing, he tried to keep agricultural prices high by destroying food. I mean, you think about that. People are going hungry in the Great Depression, yet you're destroying food to try to shift the supply of food back to keep prices high. Well, prices didn't need to be high. They needed to be allowed to fall. And wages, they instituted a minimum wage, and wages needed to come down. And so this adjustment was this adjustment here was absolutely practically prohibited. So they did exactly the wrong thing. And that's one reason why the Great Depression lasted so long, is every time it started to recover, they'd slap on something that stopped it from recovering. So it's really too bad because they didn't know any better, but these regulations literally kept us from recovering from the Great Depression. So what got us out of the Great Depression? Oh, well, also because of the stickiness of wages going down, certainly, that would have been a very long process anyway. Even if the regulations didn't stop at the adjustment in its tracks, but the economy did show signs of coming back every now and then the Roosevelt administration would slap on some new regulations that would stop the recovery. They thought they were helping it. They were doing just the opposite. So, at least as far as the recovery, these things. But what they did do that was right was they enacted some programs to help people. People desperately needed help, and they instituted some programs to keep people, from starving and all that. But as far as helping the economy actually recover, well, that was a mixed bag there. John Maynard Keynes pointed out. Back then, the economists were basically saying, just leave it alone, and this will happen. These shifts will take place, and everything will adjust. Wages will adjust, prices will adjust, and we'll be back at full output and full employment. And that's true. That would have happened. It would have taken a long time. And John Maynard Keynes, who is really the inventor of macroeconomics, saw things differently. He said, in the long run, everything will be okay, but Keynes's response to that was, in the long run, we're all dead. So you may have heard that comment before. In the long run, we're all dead. And Keynes saw that this adjustment, even if left alone, even if without the regulations stopping it, even if it was allowed to take place, would take a long time. Keynes was asked if he'd seen anything like the Great Depression. He said, yeah, the Dark Ages, they lasted for 400 years or whatever it was. So he saw that this was going to take a long time. And what Keynes advocated was that government get involved and shift this aggregate demand curve back out here through government increases in spending. Now, Roosevelt administration did do some of that, to their credit. So I think the best description of the response was there was one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake. They had the foot on the brake, not allowing this downward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve, and then they had a foot on the gas with this increase in government spending, but it was not nearly on the level that Keynes advocated. Keynes thought it should be a lot more, and apparently that was the case. Now, so what did end the Great Depression? Well, I better draw a new graph here. What ended the Great Depression was World War II. War may be hell, but for the economy, it may be. In this case, what it did was we're way back here with aggregate demand, and large chunks of government spending shifted this aggregate demand curve back out. In fact, it went out the other way. Okay, we actually went from this Great Depression to way out here to an economic boom. And let me draw a little better graph here. Okay, so with World War II, when we're still here in the Great Depression, aggregate demand is way down here, and it gradually shifts out as government spending on tanks and airplanes and all kinds of things for war. But it didn't stop here. It just kept on going way out to here. So we went from the Great Depression way out here to an economic boom. And the situation was unemployment was about 1%. See, back here, unemployment is 25%. Out here is 1%. And GDP increased 5 times. Okay, I mean, it just exploded from here out to here. And what, again, government spending increased. And that's what Keynes was advocating, to shift the aggregate demand curve back out here. But it never was done on a scale large enough. And it took the war by force to shift it way out, not just to here, but actually out here, and we had an economic boom during World War II. Now let's talk about the economic stagflation in the early 1970s. Crude oil is a major input into our economy, and some of the largest economic fluctuations have been from an interruption of the flow of oil. Now, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, a cartel, they banded together and they cut the output of oil. You know, they can act as a monopoly. And that sent oil prices doubled from 1973 to 75. Oil prices doubled. What's that going to do to cost and inflationary expectations? So what happened there is this sent the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting up. We call that a shock, okay, a supply shock. So now we're back here. We have falling GDP, and we have rising prices. Okay, falling GDP and rising prices. In the Keynesian world, that was not supposed to happen. We weren't supposed to have inflation and recession at the same time. Here we have a recession. We have falling GDP. Here we have inflation. We have rising prices. And during that time, we had inflation of over 10%. And unemployment was 4.9%. In 1973, and by 1975, it was 8.5%. Now contrast this to 1986, when two of the OPEC countries couldn't get along. In fact, Iran and Iraq were at war. So that's not exactly getting along. And how did they finance their war? By increasing their output of oil. I mean, OPEC's, they're all banding together to act as a monopoly. They're cutting back production of oil so they can get a higher price for it. And in microeconomics, you'll learn that goods that are inelastic in demand, when the price goes up, revenues go up. And so they were holding back output to get higher prices and higher revenues. However, Iran and Iraq, well, they needed money to fight their war against each other. So they're cranking out oil like crazy. So what that does is send oil prices down. And again, since oil is such an important input into our economy, that sends the short-run aggregate supply curve down. And so what we've got there is decreasing prices, a price level, and an economic boom. And here in 1986, we had a little spurt in economic activity. And I don't think the price level, this is where the model doesn't exactly get it right. The price level in this case didn't actually fall, but the rate of inflation fell. Okay? So the rate of inflation fell. We still had rising prices, but not nearly as much. We'd been coming out of that the price inflation of the high inflation of the late 70s, and in the early 80s we were still getting that down. But it brought it down and it increased output, and there we have it. Our little economic model does a pretty darn good job of modeling these events. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So that concludes our introduction to our economic model. Now in the next chapter, we're going to look at government attempts. We've already kind of talked about this, but just by way of introduction, when demand is less than where we want it to be, government might be able to stimulate demand, here we are, to move it back out here. And there are two ways to do this. The Federal Reserve Bank can use what is called monetary policy to try to shift aggregate demand through capital investment. They can alter the money supply and interest rates, and if they want to shift aggregate demand to the right, they can put pressure on interest rates to go down, making capital investment cheaper, and shift the aggregate demand curve out to the right. The other is called fiscal policy, and that there's two things involved in fiscal policy. There's tax rates. You could lower taxes so consumption goes up, or just government spending directly. New highways, new defense, new rockets, new whatever, okay? So that would be another way to shift aggregate demand. So what that's all about is demand management. They're trying to manage the aggregate demand curve, and that's what the next chapter is about, moving that demand curve around, and how, you know, can we really do it? I mean, as you'll find, it's hard. It's really hard to do this. So anyway, that's aggregate supply and aggregate demand.
All right, guys, that'll do it for today. Let's, again, this will be due a week from today. And by the way, always feel free to ask me questions. The best way to get a hold of me through Blackboard Messages. I'm in there more. I don't even look at my email until I'm done with Blackboard. And plus, it's just, well, I'll admit it's easier for me because I know, your emails, as I said before, get stuck with 5 million other emails that I'm getting from all over campus and all over the world. Who knows what, vendors, publishers, the whole bit. And, feel free to ask. And some of you have, and I suspect some of you probably should and haven't. But yeah, if you run into trouble. And again, as I said at the beginning of class, use those other resources too. They're included there in MindTap. Okay, well, have a great weekend. And again, feel free, Blackboard Messages. I'm here. I'm reasonably approachable, I think. So anyway, have a great one. Talk to you
Professor?
Tuesday. Sure.
I messaged you last night through Blackboard about setting up a meeting. I was just wondering, I didn't get to look at your response this morning. I came right to class.
Yeah, I did respond. Hold on just a second. I thought I had a meeting at 11, but maybe not. I've got to check. But if I don't, are you available at 11?
I'm not available at 11. I would actually, it would have to be either tomorrow or the next day. Today is just, I got a bunch of classes filling up the rest of the day for me. But if you're available either tomorrow or the day afterwards, that would be great.
Yeah,
anytime.
I'm available tomorrow. But in the meantime, if you have specific questions, please let me know, and I can. We don't have to wait till tomorrow. I can work them and post them for the whole class. If you got questions, or if you need an extension or anything, we can do that right away. But if you want to chat here via Zoom, we can do that too. We can do both.
Okay. I'm doing today, I have a meeting with my tutor, Professor Childress, and I'm going to be doing a lot of the content that I'm missing with her today. But besides that, I realized that from when you would let me go back into MindTap and complete some assignments that I was having trouble turning in. Mm-hmm. The chapter 25 was also missing. I just realized this last night. I was wondering if you could help me get back into that one, so I can complete that one.
Sure. I'll get
yeah, because I was gonna do that with the tutor today.
Okay, I'll do that right now, so you'll have that available.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, that would be the only one though, and then the rest of them, I think I've figured out a foolproof way to be able to turn these in. I was able to turn in chapter 28 with no problem, so I should be good for the rest of the semester, I hope.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I won't have to bother you anymore.
Don't say it that way. You're not bothering me.
No, seriously, dude. I've messaged you probably like 20 times this semester.
Hey,
I'm sure that I've messaged you.
That's why I make the big bucks. No, don't.
All right,
feel
listen,
that.
I appreciate
Do not
it, Professor.
Feel that way. Do not. I command you not to feel that way. Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, but and feel free to get back to me if you want. So we'll go from there. All right.
I will for sure. Yeah, I got a class that starts in 5 minutes, but I appreciate it. Thank you again for your help.
Okay.
Throughout the entire semester, you've been really fair with me. I highly appreciate it.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Hopefully you got something out of all this.
Oh no, I mean, I've definitely, I've came to every class, so I've definitely learned I'm pretty sure I'm taking another macroeconomics course. It might be micro this coming semester, and I feel really good going into it about what I do know.
Okay.
So yeah, no, it's been very helpful. I got to get going though.
Okay.
I got a class coming up here in just a couple minutes. So I thank you again and have a good day.
Okay, you too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Mr. Ford?
Yeah.
Yesterday I sent you a message on Blackboard. Did you receive it? I just wanted.
I did.
Yeah. I just want to inform that I don't know. Like, do you want to go over together or?
Well, yeah, we can do that. It's just that biology lab.
Yes, I just can't get it. I don't know why.
That is strange. And it says there are people in it. Oh, whoops. You know what? I am just I've got to practice doing this. Can you see me, by the way?
Yes.
I can't see you. You have your mic off? Your camera off?
Yeah.
Okay. I've got to, what I got to do is practice on this thing because I just keep doing. Okay, there we go. Weird stuff with it. The Zoom, I mean. Okay. When do you want to go over it? When are you available?
Let me see. Are you free tomorrow at noon?
Yeah. Tomorrow's Friday at noon. Yeah. Friday at noon.
Friday at noon. Yeah. Around probably like 1 because my class at 12.
Okay, at 1 o'clock then. Friday at 1. Sounds good?
Yes.
I'll see you then.
All right. Have a nice day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.